Okay, Algebra 1 students, so we're going to go ahead and go over our notes for today. Now, I want you to be aware that on your notes and on your worksheet, there are very specific instructions on the top of every page. That was also part of the reason I broke this into 3 pages. So make sure you are actually solving the quadratic using the method that it's telling you to use. That way you can show mastery of all the different methods that we have learned in this chapter. Okay, so in problem number 1, this is 9.2, solving an equation by factoring. In number 1, you'll notice that it was already factored, right? When we have parentheses, then we know that they already factored it. So this is in factored form. If you recall when we were learning how to factor, once we factor our quadratic, then we say, well, if 2 things multiply together and equal 0, that means one of those things must be 0. So we set both factors equal to 0. And then we just have to solve from there. So this one is already solved for. To solve this one for x, I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides and get x equals -2. So my answer here is x equals 0 and x equals -2. So that was one where they had already factored for us and we just need to solve for x. Let's look at one where we have to factor ourselves. So in number 2, you'll notice that we need to do the factoring. Now there is a number in front of the r squared. So this isn't just regular factoring where you draw an x. First we need to multiply the 3 times the -4. So what is 3 times -4? -12. So we want to think of something that multiplies to -12 but adds to -11. That's going to be -12 and a +1. So if you remember, when we have a number in front of our r squared, we cannot just go straight to parentheses. We need to write this as 3r squared minus 12r plus 1r minus 4. And then we factor by grouping. So we look at our first 2 terms here, and we determine what the greatest common factor is of those 2 terms. So my greatest common factor that I'm seeing here is 3r. They both have a 3r in common. If I factor out the 3r, I'm going to be left with an r from the 3r squared and a -4 from the -12r. Then I'm going to look at my second group here and try to determine what the GCF is of those terms. So they have nothing in common. So I'm just going to factor out a 1. If I factor out a 1, that means nothing changes, so I still have r minus 4. Okay, so luckily for us, we got the same thing inside the parentheses. So that means that is our greatest common factor. And if we multiply it by 3r plus 1, we will get the quadratic equation that we started with. So all these steps that we did above got us to the same format that we were in when problem 1 started. So now we just need to do the steps that we did in problem number 1. So if we have 2 factors and they multiply together to equal 0, that means one of them must be 0. So we're going to set both of them equal to 0 and solve for r. On the left-hand side, I have r minus 4 equals 0. To get r by itself, I'm going to add 4 to both sides to get r equals 4. And on the right-hand side, I'm still trying to get r by itself. So I have 3r plus 1 equals 0. The first thing I need to do is subtract 1, so I get 3r equals -1. To get the r completely by itself, I'm going to divide by 3 and get that r is equal to -1/3. So those are 2 examples for factoring. I will start another video to answer questions 3 and 4, which also deal with factoring quadratic equations.